The second reading today is one that St. Paul is writing. It's the letter to the Hebrews. And he mentions in there lots of things that for the people that he's writing to would have been very clear, obviously. The problem is for us when we hear these things that refer back to the Jewish temple, we have a couple of disadvantages that the Hebrews that St. Paul is writing to did not have. First of all, the temple was destroyed in the year 70 AD. So about 30 years after Jesus rises and ascends to his Father, 30 or 35 years later, the temple that had been in Jerusalem for thousands of years was destroyed. And so we have the disadvantage of, first of all, just time-wise, we're almost 2,000 years later. For the last 2,000 years, there's been no temple, and there's been no sacrifices, there's been no high priest, there's been none of that. So we really don't. It's not like we could go to the temple now and see it if we wanted to, or watch the sacrifices going on. Whereas the people that St. Paul's writing to in the letter to the Hebrews, he's writing to them maybe even perhaps before the temple was destroyed. Even if it had been, they would have all had family and friends and would have grown up hearing about it and knowing exactly what went on in the temple. The other disadvantage that we have is that we are not Jewish people ourselves, nor likely do we know very many people who are, just because in the sense that the two faiths are very distinct now. We all obviously, if someone's Jewish, they identify themselves as Jewish, and if someone's Catholic, they identify themselves as Catholic. But whereas back then, right around the time of Jesus and following his death and resurrection, a lot of people would have identified themselves as Jewish Christians, so to speak. They were all people, for the most part, who were Jewish and then who became followers of Christ. And for a long time, there was no difference for them. They didn't think like, oh, okay, now I have to stop receiving the Jewish newsletter and stop following the Jewish faith, and I now have to come over here and become Christian. They thought of it as one continuous thing. And so the Hebrew people, the Hebrews that St. Paul's writing to, when they hear things about the temple, they know exactly what he's talking about. But for us, we don't. And that's a real disadvantage, because I think for me, when I finally had to sit down and go back and really read the Old Testament, to read Leviticus and Numbers and Deuteronomy, and to read about what the temple was, how it was built, what went on there, when we know all of those things, then what we do here at this altar makes a lot more sense. If we put a Jewish person, a Jewish Christian person, one of these people that St. Paul was writing to, if we put them in a time machine and brought them here, this would make a lot of sense. Mass would make a lot of sense to those people. We have still, just as we had in the temple, we have an altar, we have candles, we have bread and wine, just like they did in the temple. We have a weirdly dressed priest, just like a lot of what the priest today wears goes back to what the priests were wearing in the temple. We have a tabernacle, or the Holy of Holies, an inner sanctuary where the Lord dwells, just like the temple had. But again, we lose a lot of those things, and I think it's really important to maybe revisit that, and I want to do that more, throughout the year or whenever the opportunity presents itself. I remember with one of the first things that's really important to understand that went on in the temple is that it was basically a slaughterhouse. The altar was continually having animals killed on it by the priest. And so the priest, one of the reasons that they would wear vestments is because they were butchers, basically, constantly, continuously carving up animals, killing them on the altar. There was blood just sort of, flowing from the temple. It depended on what, you needed, there was the Jewish laws laid out different types of sacrifice. If you committed a sin, you needed to bring these animals. If you needed to pray for a good harvest, you needed to bring these animals for sacrifice. And so the line was just continuous. The priest was just constantly killing animals and burning parts of them to God, and then giving other parts to these people and so forth. But it was basically a slaughterhouse, and it's really important to understand that. When I was teaching it, trying to pass this idea on to students, it was a lot of fun. We dressed them up, and then I had them bring in stuffed animals, and then then the priest would stand over the altar. We kind of set up in the gym like a makeshift sort of temple. And then so the priest would stand there, and then we'd have one kid cut open the stuffed animal, another kid squirting ketchup all over the place, just so people could kind of get a visual of what that was like. They were warned ahead of time that their stuffed animal would be slaughtered. But, I don't think we hear things, again, like what St. Paul's talking about. There's no need now to offer sacrifices. We're like, oh yeah, that's nice. But I think we lose the connection that St. Paul's trying to make with what went on in the temple. What I'm suggesting is that we can really grow in appreciation for the Mass when we recognize and start to learn what went on in the temple before Christ's time. So now we're not killing animals on the altar. Instead of death taking place on the altar, what is happening is a piece of bread that is dead, is not alive, becomes Christ. It becomes alive. And so the opposite, in a way, is happening. And it becomes Christ on the altar, but Christ crucified, So there is, in a sense, there is death taking place on the altar, just as there was in the Jewish temple. But now it's not a dove or a squirrel or an ox, it's Christ. It's God. And just as in the temple, they would have taken these animals and said, okay, Lord, look at this blood that's been spilled and allow this blood to take the place of my blood. And you would lift that up and, kind of show God and kind of hide behind the animal and say, let this blood take the place of mine. Now we lift up Christ in the same exact way as they did in the temple with animals. But now we're saying, Lord, look at not just a squirrel or an ox or a cow's leg. Look at your Son. Let your Son's blood take the place of mine. And for a lot of Jewish people, they would walk in and see this, what we're doing here, and they would read St. Paul and they would be like, okay, yeah, that makes sense. Christ is taking the place. Christ becomes the new sacrifice at the altar with candles, with the priest in a tabernacle. But we lose that, and I think that's really unfortunate. And a lot of Catholics, there's a lot of things that are out there now today trying to help Catholics re-understand and reimagine and see what the temple was like. I'm not exactly sure, there's things we can do, thinking about building a temple, a makeshift temple in the yard here next door. Not actually. But there are things we can do, I think, to grow in understanding, and I'd like to lay that out as a challenge for us to reimagine and to be able to learn more about our Jewish roots. We have in the back, too, some talks. The Legion of Mary helped us purchase the Lighthouse CDs that are in the back. I think that can be a really good thing for us. Lots of great topics back there. Basically, you just make a donation for the CD. And those CDs, parishes, they're popping up everywhere around the country. And I know a lot of priests who have said those CDs have helped people it's really helped the parish come to new understandings of the faith. And so there's the ones explaining the roots of the Eucharist back there, if you're interested in that, or books that we can read or things like that. But I just want us to be aware that there are a lot of things going on in that temple that we need to understand, because it helps us understand what we're doing here. And so I just want to lay that out as a challenge and let you know that we'll be looking for other opportunities too to sort of reconnect, if you will, with our Jewish roots, with the roots of our faith that go all the way back to the temple.